Be'ezras Hashem, with God's help, we begin today the third set of laws in this fourth book of the Rambam, Hilchos, Yibum, Vachalitzah. The laws of Yibum, of Levirate marriage, and Chalitza, which literally means removal, but is actually a name for a ritual procedure that's associated with Levirate marriage, as we will discuss in the coming chapters. The basic scenario of Yibum is the one that appears here on the screen, and we're going to return to this tens of times throughout the next 8 days. So it's very important to become familiar with it. We have a guy who's married, and he dies childless, leaving behind no descendants. His brother has an obligation to marry the dead brother's wife. The obligation is so strong that the moment he dies, a bond is created between this man and woman. It's called a zika. That's the Hebrew word for it, as we'll soon discuss. The moment he dies, a bond is created. And this woman cannot get married to anybody else until that bond is taken care of. Either by virtue of marrying the Yavam, that's what his name is, the live brother is called the Yavam. Either by marrying him, by doing Yibum, in which case the bond has been tied this way between them, and if that marriage ever dissolves, then she's permitted to marry anybody else. The other way to dissolve this bond is by the process of Chalitza, which I said before means removal. It's a complicated procedure where you go to the court and this brother, the Yavam, must put on a shoe, a special shoe. As a matter of fact, here's a picture of it. This is a picture of an actual Chalitza shoe. It has many halachic parameters that define how exactly it has to be made. And he wears this shoe. The woman goes to the court, takes off the shoe in front of the presence of the court, and also has to spit, as we'll discuss all the details of this procedure. And that dissolves the bond between the man and the woman, and now she's free to marry. So the moment this husband dies, one of two things must happen. Yibum, she must marry the live brother, or Chalitza, she must disconnect herself by removing his shoe in the presence of the court. Now, understand that the whole idea of Yibum, the whole idea of this marriage taking place, runs in direct contradiction to a prohibition stated elsewhere in the Torah. There's a prohibition to engage in relations with your brother's wife. That's clear. In the portion of Arayot, the portion of immoral relationships, the verse clearly says, Ervas Eisha Sachicha Lo Yisegale. You shall not uncover the nakedness of the wife of your brother. And so it's important to appreciate that this is one mitzvah overriding another. And that concept is going to come into play many times in cases where you'll see that we actually defer the obligation of Yibum. The reason will many times involve this concept. If there's even a chance that we're going to be violating the prohibition without fulfilling the mitzvah of Yibum, we'd rather avoid it. We'll soon talk about the fact that in the Ashkenazic communities, because of this, we don't even do Yibum anymore. But we'll leave that for a moment. But this is the basic outline of the concepts of Yibum and Chalitza. And appreciating this, let's begin the Rambam itself. As the Rambam always does, he begins every set of laws by telling us which mitzvahs are going to be discussed in this set of laws. The Rambam says, Yesh bichlolon shalish mitzvahs. There are 3 mitzvahs going to be discussed in the following 8 chapters. Shtei mitzvahs aseh, or mitzvah achas lo yisaseh. 2 positive mitzvahs and 1 negative mitzvah. V'zehu pratan, and these are their details. Aleph, liyaben. First is the mitzvah to consummate a levirate marriage. Again, that's the case where the husband dies childless and the brother chooses to actually go forth with the marriage. That's the ideal way of fulfilling the mitzvah according to the Rambam. Beis, the second mitzvah to be discussed is the mitzvah lachaloitz, to do the process of removal. And again, this is in a case where Yibum is not going to be performed for any number of reasons that can come into play. The bond here still needs to be dissolved, and that's by the mitzvah of chalitza, where the woman removes the shoe of this brother in the presence of the court. The third mitzvah to be discussed in the chapters, I actually mentioned it in passing before, Gimel, shaloi tinase yavama li'ish zar. This woman, who is called the Yavama, by the way, she's waiting in the wings for Yibum to be performed. This woman cannot get married to anybody else ad shetasir reshus hayavam me'aleha, until she removes the jurisdiction, the authority of the Yavam, that's the brother here, from upon her. V'ha'isha shehi ru'uya li'yibum. Any woman who was waiting in the wings for Yibum to be performed, nikres zekuka li'yibum, is called bound to Yibum. Zekuka, that's the Hebrew word. Or reshus hayavam, and the authority that the Yavam holds over her, which she must dissolve, nikras zika, is called bond, zika bond. And this is the bond which must be dissolved either by marriage or by chalitza. It's very rare that the Rambam gives us these definitions in the beginning of a set of laws. That's because it's so important going in. These are going to be terms that are going to be used over and over again, and so we have to know them going in to the chapters. Ubir mitzvahs elu b'prakim elu. The explanation of these mitzvahs will come in the following chapters. Chapter 1, which we're beginning now, Perek Rishon, is occupied mainly with defining terms. What does it mean, a child? Because the whole scenario of Yibum comes into place if the husband dies childless. So what qualifies as a child? What if the woman is pregnant at the time of death? We're going to discuss all these cases. It also defines what's a brother. I was just using the word loosely before. The brother of the dead husband has to marry the wife. What qualifies as a brother? What about a wife? What qualifies as a wife? What if there's multiple wives involved? We'll talk about that. The age, the minimum age of the brother and of the woman for Yibum or Chalitza to go forward. And we'll also talk about some of the basic consequences that arise if Yibum or Chalitza goes into play in terms of family, in terms of now who this man and who this woman can marry in the future. That's where we're headed for today's chapter. Perek Rishon, the Rambam begins halacha aleph. Mitzvah saseh min haTorah. It's a positive biblical commandment, sheyiyabim adam eshes achiv me'aviv, that a person should consummate a levirate marriage with the wife of his paternal brother. Paternal brother means that they share the same father. As we're going to see soon in this chapter, if they only share the same mother, they're not considered brothers for this element of halacha. But if they have the same father, and the husband dies childless, so he has to do levirate marriage, bein min hanisuin, bein min ha'erusin. Whether this marriage entered the full stage of nisuin, of consummated marriage, or whether it was only an erusin. There was just the original consecration. He handed her a ring, and that already created a marriage between them on some level, and he dies in meis b'lei zera. If he dies with no descendants, this man, the brother here, needs to step in and marry the dead brother's wife. Shenemar, as it says, and this is the core verse about Yibum, which we're going to return to many times in many contexts. Now we'll just read the full verse here, even though the Rambam doesn't quote the whole thing. It says, Ki yeshvu achim yachtav, if two brothers are living together, umeis achad mehem, one of them dies, uvein ein loy, this is the key words here, and he has no son. And we're going to define soon that son doesn't mean male son, it means no children at all. Loitia eshes hameis hachutza leish zar, the wife of the dead person is not allowed to marry to the outside to a strange man. Instead, Yevama Yavai Aleha, her Yavam, her husband's brother, needs to have relations with her. Take her as a wife and consummate Yibum, the levirate marriage. So the Rambam, let's turn to the Rambam, he quotes only the red words. Shenemar, as it says, Uvein ein loy, if he has no son, Yevama Yavai Aleha, the Yavam, her Yavam, should have relations with her. Biblically, unlike a regular marriage, which must have two stages, where the husband, one does kiddushin, consecration, and only then does nisuin, as we've seen at length in the earlier set of laws in this book. Biblically, when it comes to the yivama, in this case, this man, before he marries the yivama, doesn't need to do any formal act of consecration. The way we look at it is, this is already his predestined wife, whom they have handed off from heaven to him. Simply engage in relations, consummate the marriage. Uksubasa al nichse baila shemes. And the kesuba obligation, which typically needs to take place at the beginning of any marriage, here falls on the estate of the dead brother, the original husband. In other words, this man doesn't have to provide a new ketubah before entering the marriage. He simply consummates the marriage and that's it. Now, tomorrow in chapter 2, we're going to see that rabbinically, there is some formal type of consecration which must take place before Yibum can happen. But biblically, there's no need for that. This is the ideal mitzvah. The ideal mitzvah when the scenario takes place is for Yibum to happen, for a marriage to take place between the live brother and the wife. However, halacha beis says the Rambam, if either the man or the woman do not want to go forth with this marriage, now there's still a bond between them which has to be dissolved. So the husband must perform the rite of chalitza. If you appreciate the Hebrew grammar, the interpretation is that the husband does the chalitza rite to the wife. Even though in practice, it's the woman who takes the much more active role in chalitza, it's called choletz on behalf of the brother because he has to initiate it. It's his mitzvah. So he does the chalitza procedure. And only afterwards will she have the bond released and she'll be able to marry any other person. It's a biblical commandment, a biblical positive commandment to do the chalitza procedure in the case where no yibum is desired to take place. Shenemar, as it says, and here is the verse which describes chalitza, one of the verses. says in the earlier verse that if the husband doesn't want to take her, she goes, le'enei hazkenim, to the eyes of the elders. V'choltza nale, that's the words that the Rambam quotes. She removes his shoe, etc., with a whole procedure, and that is chalitza, which dissolves that bond between them. And the Rambam says, u'mitzvas yibum koidemes lemitzvas chalitza. Ideally, the mitzvah of performing the actual Levirate marriage takes precedence over the mitzvah of the chalitza procedure, which means ideally we should try to get this brother and the widow married. Now, as I mentioned before, the mitzvah of Yibum runs in direct contradiction to the prohibition of marrying the wife of your brother. The Talmud makes mention that in later times, the sages stopped having people do Yibum because they were worried that they weren't having the right intentions. They weren't intending to do the mitzvah. And the moment you aren't intending to do the mitzvah, the prohibition of marrying your brother's wife rises into effect, which is a very severe prohibition. So they had to stop allowing people to do Yibum altogether, and simply anytime the situation arose, they would have chalitza be done. They would have the chalitza procedure. But the Rambam writes, already in his commentary to the Talmud, and here clear as well, that that's not the case in the matter of final halacha. In the matter of final halacha, we don't worry whether they're intending for the mitzvah or not. The mitzvah of Yibum is always the one that's to be performed ideally. This is how all Sephardi rabbis ruled throughout the ages, including the Shulchan Aruch himself rules that Yibum comes before chalitza. However, the Ashkenazi authorities, all throughout the generations, ruled that we do not do Yibum anymore, we only do chalitza instead. And it's a fascinating difference of opinion, even though today I would say that most Sephardi communities already stopped doing Yibum pretty much because it creates different other issues in terms of the relationship. But as a matter of dry halacha, the Sephardi authorities were always on the side of Yibum, and the Ashkenazi authorities were always on the side of chalitza. The Rebbe has a fascinating talk in 1987 where he says, there's another interesting difference in custom between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi communities when it comes to marriage. And that is that in the Ashkenazi communities, we have the Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom imposed in the 11th century that one should not marry more than one wife, because there might be a worry that he won't be able to support for both of them, and that can cause a lot of friction. The Sephardi authorities never accepted this Cherem, they never accepted this ban, and they were allowed to keep on marrying more than one wife. And the Rebbe says it's very interesting, we can actually link the two differences of opinion, differences of custom, because technically what started these two bans in the Ashkenazi communities was the effect of exile. Jews were exiled from their land, they weren't living in ideal conditions, and that caused both a spiritual and a physical downfall. Spiritually, Jews weren't as attuned to doing mitzvahs in the right way as they should. Physically, being in exile took away many of the Jews' livelihoods and financial stability. Factually, historically, Ashkenazi Jewry suffered more in exile than Sephardi Jewry. So the Rebbe says that's why in Ashkenazi Jewry these bans were more accepted, because they experienced the downfall of exile on a much greater level, both spiritually and physically. So they stopped doing Yibum for fear that they weren't intending for mitzvahs, and they also stopped marrying more than one wife. Whereas the Sephardi communities who didn't experience the galut as much, they didn't have these spiritual or physical downfalls as much, and therefore were still able to do the mitzvah of Yibum in its ideal form, as well as keep marrying more than one wife in the cases where that was a necessity of the situation. At any rate, we continue the Rambam here. Let's move on to define what does it mean, children. You have to be childless for Yibum to go into effect. What qualifies as a child? Says the Rambam Malacha Gimel Zeh shenemar b'Torah. When it says in the Torah, uvein ein loy, that he dies with no son, echad haben ve'echad habas, or zera haben zera habas. The truth is, it means whether a son or a daughter, and it could even mean descendants of the son or the daughter. So if there's a grandchild in the picture, even if the son or daughter are no longer alive, that qualifies as having children, and Yibum is not required if the grandfather dies. Since he has children at any rate, Yibum doesn't go into effect. He can have a child, whether from a different wife or from this wife. In other words, let's say he's married to two wives, and he has a child from the other wife. Even if in this marriage there was no children, the fact of the matter is he has a child. And so the obligation of Yibum does not devolve onto the brother. The fact that he has children from a different marriage exempts his current wife from having to engage in either procedure of chalitza or Yibum. Even if he has a child who's illegitimate, or a child who has turned on his religion, he serves idols. It exempts his wife from going forward with any procedure of chalitza or of yibum. Because the Torah says he has to have no child. And here he has a child, even if the child isn't as religious as you would hope him to be. But a child who he fathers from a maidservant or from a Gentile woman, that's not counted as a child for these laws. It does not exempt his wife if he dies childless from his marriage to the Jewish wife. And all he has is a child left behind from a non-Jewish woman or from a maidservant, that doesn't count as a child. Because a child that comes from a maidservant himself is a slave. The habamina kusi, and a child which comes from a Gentile is considered a Gentile. And it's as if they don't exist for the purposes of this conversation. Look what the Torah says about children born from a maidservant. This is in the portion that discusses the laws of a Jewish slave. And it says that if a slave, while enslaved, marries a Jewish woman, ha'isha viladeha tiyaladeneha. Both the woman and her children belong to the master, which means they never get attributed to the person who fathers them. Melamed shavlada kimaisa. This teaches us that the baby of a maidservant is just like her. Uvekusi soemer, and about a Gentile it says, Ki yasir es bincha me'acharai. In the book of Devarim it says that if you let your children marry out to non-Jews, what's going to happen is the descendants that will be born from there are going to be removed astray. Ki yasir es bincha me'acharai. Actually, this is a reference specifically to when a Jewish man marries a non-Jewish woman. The description in the Torah is that the father-in-law, the father of the non-Jewish woman, will pull your son away from me, says Hashem. And the consequences are that their kids will be reckoned on the side of the non-Jews. He removes any future children from being counted among the community. Even if in the end, the boy or the child born from the maidservant is freed, or the child born from the non-Jewish woman converts, they're like any other convert, any other freed slave, they don't get attributed to their former blood relative. And they cannot exempt the current wife from having to engage in Yibum or Chalitza. But what if he had a child from his own maidservant, he owned the maidservant and had relations with her, had a child, and then freed the child, and then freed the maidservant and married her, and dies without children? This is a fascinating case here. He first had relations with this one maidservant, had a child who wouldn't be considered his, freed them both, and then engaged in relations with her, the same woman, again, this time as a free woman, and dies with no children from the current marriage. Literally it emerges, she's going to get married to the brother of her dead husband, even though she has a child, her own child, who's alive and free, but because he wasn't born in the current state of free marriage, he's not considered to be the brother's child, the husband's child, and therefore the brother must marry the wife. If a man dies, leaving his wife in limbo, she's pregnant, is that considered a child or not? Does the brother have to do Yibum or Chalitza or not? Says the Rambam, we have to wait and see what happens with the child. If she miscarries after the death of the husband, she indeed must do Yibum. But if she gave birth and the baby emerged alive to the heir of the world, even if he died in the moment that he was born, his mother now is exempt from doing Chalitza or Yibum because the child was born. But rabbinically, we have to be able to ascertain this only applies if we know for sure that all the months of pregnancy have been completed, and he was born after 9 complete months. But if we don't know how many months into the pregnancy he was born, then 1 day of life is not enough. If he lives for 30 days, that's a viable child, and will exempt any wives of his father from having to do any chalitza or yibum rights. But if he dies within 30 days, even on the 30th day, no matter how he dies, whether he dies of sickness, or he dies because he fell off the roof, or because a lion eats him up. We can never ascertain his status. We don't know if it's a miscarried baby, or an inviable child, or a viable child. And assuming that it's not a real child, the woman is bound to the dead husband's brother. We can't let the Yibum go forth, because maybe it is a child. So what we have to do is we have to dissolve the bond in the least harmful way, the least severe way, which is chalitza. We require the brother to give this woman chalitza rabbinically. But she cannot, of course, consummate a Yibum marriage. That is as far as defining children. Let's now define brother. Somebody who has a brother, at any rate, no matter who he is. Whether he is an illegitimate boy or he is an idolater. Bein katan, bein gadol, whether he's minor or major, no matter how old he is. So long as his head and most of his body emerged into the world before the brother of his died. In other words, even if he's in the birthing stages, but he was in the world at one point, if they shared a world together. No matter if he's a baby, his existence binds the dead husband's wife to the obligation of Yibum. Because he's there. There's a brother. But if he only has a brother born from a maidservant or from a Gentile woman, even if they share the same father, he's not considered to be his brother for any matter, and his existence does not bind the wife to Yibum. Even if he was born in holiness, which means he was conceived with a non-Jewish woman, and during the pregnancy, this non-Jewish woman converted, so that he was born in a state of full Jewishness. Since his conception was not in a state of holiness while the mother was still Gentile, the boy born ultimately is not considered to be the brother of the current dead husband. Maternal brothers are not considered to be brothers only with regard to the laws of mourning and testimony. When they die, one has to mourn for them, and in terms of testimony, they're considered to be relatives and they cannot testify together. With regards to inheritance, Yibum with regards to this law of Levirate marriage and the Chalitza procedure, their existence is as if they don't exist. Because biblical brotherhood only exists paternally. You must share the same father to be considered a full-fledged brother. Such that if these two people only share a mother, but they're born from different fathers, we don't even care about him, he's not in the picture, and as soon as he dies, the woman is free to marry anybody else. Converts that convert, slaves that are freed, they don't have brotherhood. And if two brothers convert, they're considered strangers to each other. Even if one of the boys was conceived in a Gentile state, his mother went to mikvah, converted while she was pregnant, and he was born in a holy state. And the second brother was fully conceived and born in a state of Jewishness. The fact that the first brother was was conceived in a Gentile pregnancy already makes him a stranger to the future brother. Even if it was twin brothers, both conceived as Gentiles and born in a state of Jewishness, they do not have a state of brotherhood between them, till they're both conceived and born together in a state of Jewishness, in a state of holiness. Otherwise, their existence doesn't matter to each other, and if either of them will die childless, the brother has no obligation. The Yibum doesn't devolve onto him, and the widow is free to marry anybody else. Halacha tes, we move on to defining the wife's side of things. Misha hayole nashim rabbis v'meis. A man has many wives, and he dies. So technically, the moment that he dies, all three of them, let's call it in this example, we have three, all three of them have a bond created between them and this Yavam, the brother. However, bi'asa or chalitzasa shel achas mehen paiteres es hashar. Relationship or chalitza right performed to one of them exempts the others. In other words, as long as he marries one of them or does chalitza to one of them, these two are free to go as well. As a matter of fact, you aren't allowed to do a levirate marriage with two of the wives. Shanemar, because it says, and this is a verse that is actually part of the description of the chalitza procedure, but what it says is, the woman removes the shoe, and she says, Kacha ye'aseh la'ish, so is done to the man, asher lo yivne es beis achiv, who doesn't want to build the house of his brother. Which implies that a person who does Yibum is building the house of his brother. But notice the Torah's wording. House is singular. Shenemar, let's look in the Rambam, it says, Asher lo yivne es beis achiv, he doesn't build his brother's house, which means that on the flip side, if he chooses to, bayis echad bayne ve'ene bayne shnei batin, he can only build up one house, not two. So in the case where the brother left behind multiple wives, he is only able to do Yibum with one of them. The same on the flip side. If there was multiple brothers, I didn't have a picture for this, but you can imagine on the flip side, if there'll be one wife and multiple brothers. Only one of the brothers needs to do Yibum or Chalitza to one of the wives, and thereby permit all the other co-wives to be married to whoever they want. We take a look at the genealogical status of these women, and we see that some of them are able to marry a Kohen in the future, and some of them are not. Let's say one of them was a divorcee from a previous marriage. A divorcee can never marry a Kohen. So, im haya miyabim, says the Rambam, if the brother wants to do Yibum, miyabim le'ezu sheyirtze, he should do Yibum to everyone he wants. Marry the one he wants. B'im haya chalitz, but if he doesn't want to do Yibum and he's choosing to do Chalitza, since the Chalitza of any one of the wives will exempt all the other ones, may as well do Chalitza, says the Rambam, yachalitz la psula. You should do the Chalitza right with the woman who is already disqualified from marrying a Kohen. So he doesn't disqualify an additional kosher woman through Chalitza, as we're going to see. Just performing the rite of Chalitza in a way resembles divorce. And so the sages forbade this woman from marrying a Kohen. Some say it's even a biblical obligation, but at least rabbinically, it's forbidden. So if you're going to go ahead, let's say this woman anyways cannot marry a Kohen, and you're going to do Chalitza to this woman, now you've created unnecessarily another woman who cannot marry a Kohen. Rather do Chalitza with this woman, who's anyways disqualified, just add another layer of disqualification, no problem. And now, these two are free to go, and not just free to go, they're free to even marry a Kohen, as they were. Halacha Yud Aleph, Mesolei Achin Rabin, V'naflu Neshesei Lefanov. Poor man. He has two brothers, let's say, or three brothers. They're all married, and they all die childless. And all his wives now are bound to him. They've fallen before him. This is an expression that's going to come up many times in the Yibum, falling before him. In other words, it means the bond is created between them. In Efshal Liyabim Eskulan, if he can do levirate marriage with all of them, Miyabim, he should do that. Again, here you see the Sephardi community. The Rambam was a Sephardi, allowing more than one wife in marriage. Be'im lav, and if not, Chalitz Kulan, then he should perform Chalitza with all of them. Oy, Chalitz L'misha Yirtze, Mehen, Umiyabim L'misha Yirtze. Or he can do Chalitza with some of them, Yibum with some of them, Achas Mikol Bayis V'bayis, one woman from each household. In other words, if his brothers themselves had multiple wives, he only has to do Yibum or Chalitza. He only can do Yibum or Chalitza with one of the wives from each marriage. Halacha Yud Beis, let's talk about some consequences that arise from Yibum. HaKoines es Yivimta, if somebody brings his Yibum, his Yivama into a marriage, he consummates a Yibum, Nesru Tzareiseha Allah Val Sharach. In that moment, all of the other co-wives become forbidden to this man and to any of his other brothers. We're going to explore these cases in more detail, so I didn't make a full picture to describe this. In other chapters, we'll get to that, God willing. But it's important to note, you choose to do Yibum with one of the women, you have thereby forbidden yourself forever to the other co-wives. If you or one of the brothers indeed has relations with one of the co-wives, you have transgressed a positive commandment. Shanemar, because it says, Yevama Yavoy Aleha. Where is that verse that we had before? Classic Yibum case. Her Yavam must have relations with her, which means only with her, the woman that you choose. V'loy Aleha v'al tzarasa, not with her and another co-wife. since that's a prohibition derived from a positive commandment, right? The verse is couched in positive terms. The Yavam should have relations with her. From that we learn with her and not with anybody else. We have a principle that when a negative prohibition is derived from a positive terminology, it's considered to be a positive commandment. So that if the brother or any of his brothers will have relations with a co-wife after Yibum, they're going to transgress a positive commandment. Similarly, when somebody does Chalitza to his Yavam, so let's say they didn't do Yibum, they chose to do Chalitza. Nesra HaChalutza, the woman who Chalitza was performed with, becomes forbidden. He, v'chol tzareiseha, she and all her co-wives, ala chayletz v'al shara achen, on the brother who performed chalitza, and on all the other brothers. V'kula na'asudei saleyan midivrei sofrim kashniyas. They're all forbidden rabbinically, like a shniya. Shniya, as we saw in the laws of marriage, is a woman who is forbidden on second degree, rabbinically, to a man, not biblically. Because the moment that the brother died with no child, nistalik isur erva me'al kol nashav, the prohibition, the biblical level prohibition, has left all of his wives. And once you've done chalitza, you've dissolved the bond completely. Lefichach toifsin b'hana kiddushin kashniyas. Therefore, if you were to consecrate them, it would take hold like a rabbinically forbidden woman. Take hold in a forbidden way. But it would nevertheless take hold. You'd be considered married on some level. But it's a forbidden marriage again. Halacha Yud Gimel HaCholetz Leivimta. One who performs chalitza with his yivama. So, classic case, here he does, chalitza. Kashem shehi asur Allah, the same way she cannot marry him anymore. Kach kreveiseha asur alav. All of her relatives become forbidden to this man. Kagain ima, ubita, her mother, her daughter. V'chein hi asur livnayu la'achiv. She cannot marry his son, his brother. Afilu shniyos shala asurais. Even women who have a relationship to her that are on a rabbinic level of prohibition. Kagain bas bita, like her great granddaughter. This man cannot marry her great granddaughter. V'chein hi asur leben ben benoi. She cannot marry his great grandson. Klalei shel davar, the bottom line rule governing this issue is, harehi ki ishtei shegersha. We treat a chalitza as a woman who has been divorced. And the same way when you divorced your wife, all of her relatives become forbidden to you, and your relatives become forbidden to her, same with a chalitza woman. Similarly, what if the woman dies? She's waiting in the wings for Yibum, and she dies, while in the state of being bound. You cannot marry her relatives as if she's your wife who died under your jurisdiction. All of these prohibitions are rabbinic in nature. And the Rambam concludes this law, adam, it is permitted for a person lisa achos tsaras chalutzasoi ushar kreveiseha, to marry the sister of the co-wife of the woman on which he performed chalitza. Let's just check out this picture so we can visualize it. We have the man married to two wives. Okay, one is called the tzara, the co-wife of this wife. He dies childless. The yavam chooses to do chalitza with this woman. Now she's called a chalutza. She's a woman who chalitza was performed on. The co-wife here is called tsaras chalutzasai, the co-wife of the woman who chalitza was performed with. So while her relatives are forbidden to this guy, the co-wife's relatives, we don't go that far. And so achos tsaras chalutzasai, the sister of the co-wife of the woman upon which chalitza was performed, it's permitted to marry. This guy can now marry her and all of her other relatives as well. Because we don't go that far to impose a decree on the relatives of the co-wife who dissolved the bond. Only the wife itself with whom the bond was dissolved. Yudalid asr layavam lisa krevas skukasai. It's forbidden for the yavam to marry the relative of a woman who's waiting in the wings for him to do yibum. Like the mother or the brother. Unless one of the brothers that are alive chooses to do yibum or chalitza, and thereby removing the bond between them. And then then he can marry the mother or the daughter or any of the relatives. In other words, what the Rambam is saying over here is that although we said that a yavam himself, the guy who does the right, cannot marry any of the relatives of the woman with whom he dissolves the bond, if it was a different brother, let's say, that brother could marry the relatives of this woman, because he wasn't the one who dissolved the bond. Even though those women are forbidden to the brother who himself did the chalitza or yibum right, as we just explained, but to other brothers it's permitted. A man marries the yavam and then divorces her. marries the Yibam and divorces her. So let's go to just a classic case here. Okay, there was a bond between them after this guy died. He marries her, and then he divorces her. Im ratza lahachzir yachzir. If he wants to remarry her, he can remarry her. Because she is now his wife for all matters. In other words, we don't say, oh, now after you've done the Yibum, the prohibition of marrying your brother's wife comes back into existence. No, once you've married her in the sake of Yibum, she has become fully your wife, and no remnant of prohibition remains because of the brother. Not biblically, not rabbinically. Halacha Tezayin, the Rambam gives a general rule when it comes to the age of the men and women here involved in Yibum or Chalitza. We've already explained in the laws of marriage. From the moment a boy turns 9 years old, his relations have halachic significance. This is a tradition received orally from Moses on Mount Sinai. Therefore, if there was a Yavam who was a child and had relations with his Yavama in the sake of Yibum, if he was 9 years old already, he can keep the marriage going. But he cannot do Chalitza. He cannot dissolve the bond in the Chalitza way unless he becomes a major and is checked to see that he has produced physical signs of puberty. Because in the laws of Chalitza, the word ish is used. Here you can see it here. He has to be a man and not just a 9-year-old. Now, if he was less than 9 years old, his relations have no significance, and therefore, if he were to do relations with his Yibum, with his Yivama, it wouldn't be considered Yibum at all. Nevertheless, even though it has some significance, when a 9-year-old has relations, it hasn't done a full acquisition of the wife. The fact that he had relations with her for the sake of Yibum does not allow her to get married to anybody else later if the marriage dissolves, unless he has relations with her after he became an adult. Or does Chalitza Kamesha Yisbar, as will be explained. In other words, if he was just 9 years old, has relations and then dies, she cannot say, oh, I'm free to go. Because she hasn't had relations with a full adult male. Yud Zayin, v'chena Yavama Aktana. Same as for the Yavama, the girl, the wife. If she's a minor. If the brother wants to do Yibum with her, sure, you can do Yibum. But she cannot be part of a Chalitza procedure till she is a full adult and is checked for physical signs of puberty. Even if she had relations after 12 years old. She cannot do Chalitza procedure unless she's checked and the physical signs of maturity will be found on her body. The same way the Yavam cannot perform Chalitza until he becomes a man, so to the Yavama, the girl waiting in the wings, cannot do Chalitza unless she is a full adult woman. The Yavam Katan, Shabal, Yavama Katana, if it was a minor boy, had relations with a minor girl, for the sake of Yibum, Yigdilu Zaim Zeh, the sages said, let them grow up together, it's fine. And when they become in the age of majority, their marriage will become fully consummated. Yutes Hayavama, a woman waiting in the wings for Yibum, Leitis Yabim, Baleitachaloit, should not do Yibum or Chalitza, Acha Tamtin Tishim Yom, until she waits for 90 days. Chutz Miyema Miso, Miyema Yibum, Miyema Chalitza, besides for the day of death and the day of Yibum or Chalitza on the two ends, Kishar Kol Anashim, like any other woman. We saw this 2 days ago in chapter 12 of the Laws of Divorce. Every time a marriage ends, the woman has to wait 90 days until she enters another marriage to differentiate between children from one marriage or the other, who the father is. Now what's wrong with Chalitza? Yibum I understand. Yibum means full relations. But Chalitza is not going to be any relations here. So who cares if she does it the next day or not? Why does she have to wait 90 days? Because during the 90 days, she's not fit to do Yibum. And the Torah clearly makes contingent one upon the other. The Nemar, and it says in the Torah, when describing the ritual of Chalitza, it says, only v'im loyachpoitz ha'ish lakachas es yivimtoi, if the man doesn't desire to take the Yivama in marriage, then the whole verse that they go to court, and the choltzonaloi, then she removes the shoe, the chulu. Which means, be'ez shehi oila liyibum oila lachalitza. Only at a time when she could have technically done a levirate marriage can she do chalitza. Because man shehi oila liyibum oila lachalitza. But as long as she cannot do yibum during those 90 days, she also cannot do chalitza. If he did do Yibum or Chalitza during the 3 months, since bottom line she's not pregnant, she's exempt and needs nothing further. What if she is pregnant? A man does Chalitza to the Yavam, and it turns out she's pregnant and she gives birth. If it's a viable child, he lasts for 30 days. We consider the Chalitza procedure never to have happened. She therefore can marry a Kohen later and can marry any of the relatives, and the guy who did Chalitza can marry any of her relatives. But if she miscarried, or he didn't live for 30 days after birth, he must redo the Chalitza, either he or one of the brothers. Because the Chalitza performed with a woman who was pregnant is not a Chalitza. Neither is relations done with a pregnant woman considered to be Yibum. And so you have to do it again. Therefore, if somebody does indeed consummate a marriage, or does Chalitza with a Yivama who is pregnant, the co-wife cannot get married to anybody else on the basis of the fact that her co-wife did Yibum or Chalitza. She has to wait until the woman gives birth. Because a baby's presence only permits the mother and the mother's co-wives to marry anybody else if he emerges to the airspace of the world, so he has to be fully alive before the co-wife can get married. One who marries the Yivaman, turns out she's pregnant. We separate them and we wait. If she miscarries, so there's no child retroactively, he can go back and keep her. But if she gives birth, even if he dies the day he's born, he must divorce her. He cannot stay married to her because he basically married his brother's wife with a child. And he must do Chalitza. And then she can marry somebody else. If the baby was viable, lasted 30 days after he was born, this is a viable boy, and no divorce is required, simply the marriage dissolves by itself, because she is biblically prohibited to him. She's a brother's wife, and she had a child. So the whole marriage never began. 6 months after the Yibum, she gives birth to a baby, a viable baby, but we don't know who's the father. We are in doubt if this boy was born after 9 months and to be attributed to the first husband, the dead husband, or perhaps he was born 7 months and is to be attributed to the second husband, to the Yavam. This is a big problem which can arise if the guy transgresses and doesn't wait the 90 days. Therefore he must divorce the woman, the havlad kosher, but we say that the baby is still considered kosher, not illegitimate. But if he has relations after giving birth to this doubtful son, any children which will emerge afterwards will be doubtfully illegitimate. Because on the assumption that the original boy belonged to the first husband, by marrying this woman, he has violated a biblical prohibition. Any children born from biblical prohibition, union, are illegitimate. Yes, it's possible that the first son was also his son, not to be attributed to the first husband. Therefore, they're fake mamzerim, therefore they're doubtfully illegitimate. But even that is pretty bad. And so that's one of the major reasons why you would stay away for the 90 days and only then do Chalitza or Yibum.